Rebecca Hill habitually woke up slightly earlier than her alarm clock. The thin pre-dawn glow seeped through the semi-transparent curtains of the bedroom. She took a deep breath, but instead of a lively surge of strength, she felt only a vague anxiety. After a moment, gazing at the pale stripes of light on the wall, Rebecca realized she had once again spent a restless night. Getting out of bed, she slipped on a light robe over her shoulders and went to the bathroom. The mirror reflected the same tidy hairstyle and well-groomed face with no obvious signs of fatigue. Externally, everything remained flawless, yet she felt that something inside her had long been out of balance. Today, everything will go as usual, Rebecca reminded herself, forcing her lips to form an almost imperceptible smile. Downstairs in the spacious kitchen, marble countertops were already gleaming, and the appliances were built into the cabinets so perfectly that it resembled a showcase from an interior design magazine. And yet in this perfection, more and more often she saw not coziness, but emptiness. She poured filtered coffee into a porcelain cup, sat down at the snow-white table, and paused for a moment, listening to the familiar sound of droplets trickling into the coffee maker. Glancing around, Rebecca caught herself thinking that the entire setting felt like a stage set, static and unyielding. A picture where everything is arranged correctly, but carries no real life. Soon Michael Hill appeared, her husband who, as always, came downstairs exactly at 7 in his impeccably pressed suit. His gaze was fixed on his phone screen, most likely checking morning business notifications. Seeing Rebecca, he gave a short smile. "Good morning, honey," she responded with an equally polite smile. The warmth came more from courtesy than from genuine feeling. "Hi, Michael. The coffee's ready if you want some." Her husband nodded, gesturing his thanks. They stood just a couple of steps apart, but Rebecca felt that there was much more dividing them, a whole gulf formed by daily routines. Michael sat down at the table, scanning the news on his tablet, while Rebecca glanced fleetingly at his intent expression. There was a time when she admired that determination, but now she saw it as a wall behind which she could hardly reach the real Michael. "Do you have a lot of meetings today?" she asked, trying to strike up a conversation. "Yes, a couple of important negotiations." He gave a short nod and buried himself in his reading. "In the evening, I also need to sign new contracts." That was their entire conversation. A few exchanges of remarks, like a check mark on a to-do list. When Michael, having finished his breakfast, left the house in his usual businesslike stride, Rebecca was left alone in the kitchen. Her hand felt for the edge of the gold bracelet she wore every day as a symbol of their supposedly flawless marriage. Before, it reminded her of love and security, but now, of constraints she wasn't sure she wanted to accept. "Maybe I should take a walk in the park." The thought flashed. She hadn't gone walking in ages, always finding more important housework, wiping the counters again, putting away the dishes, planning the week's dinners. But today she was sick of it all. She needed a shake-up, at least a change of scenery outside her windows. Gathering herself in a matter of minutes, Rebecca left the house. The fresh morning breeze was sobering, and the small lawns and bushes seemed like true salvation from the stale perfection of her kitchen. After walking a few blocks along neat houses, she reached the local park. It was nothing particularly remarkable. A couple of winding paths, a shallow pond, and a few benches beneath old trees. "Why did I stop coming here?" she thought, breathing in the smell of spring dampness and wet grass. Once upon a time, this park had been her refuge. Even before she was married, she loved watching the local ducks in the pond and reading on the benches for long periods. But over the past years, Rebecca seemed to have forgotten such simple joys. She started a light jog along one of the alleys, trying to focus on the movement. With each step, the tension receded, as if with each breath and each heartbeat she was emerging from stagnation. Having run about 10 minutes, she stopped at an empty bench by the water and sat down to catch her breath. The water was calm, reflecting the refracted sun. Suddenly, she thought that life might be just as clear if only she found the key to her own courage. In the distance, there was the sound of children's laughter. Apparently, some kids had come out to play before school. A slight chill ran down Rebecca's skin. She realized she hadn't laughed herself in a long time. Truly, sincerely. She averted her gaze from the pond and turned it to her own hands, resting on her knees. The sight of the bracelet reminded her once again of Michael. of the fact that everything in her life was fine, or should be fine, but somehow was not. A sudden thought pierced her. Maybe there was a flaw in herself that kept her from appreciating what she had? Or was she truly unhappy, simply not admitting it? Rebecca sighed and stood up. Probably time to head back. No need to risk being late getting home by 9, like some irresponsible housewife. Still, taking a few steps toward the park exit, she felt a quiet urge to stay a little longer. An inner voice whispered, "Linger. The world won't collapse if you allow yourself a few extra minutes of freedom." But discipline prevailed. Stifling that impulse, Rebecca headed home. During that short time in the park, she had a strange premonition, as if changes were approaching, possibly risky yet genuine. Unaware that soon a person capable of shaking all her preconceptions would burst into her ordinary life, Rebecca felt a barely perceptible tremor akin to curiosity and fear at once. Stepping into the empty entryway, she was met by the same silence that usually pervaded mornings. Now in that silence she found no comfort, only the echo of hollow loneliness. That short moment in the park had made her acutely aware. She truly wanted change, even if afraid. Finishing her usual tasks, making the bed, putting away the newspaper her husband had left, and cooking lunch, Rebecca noticed that time once again felt as though it had stopped. Leaning against the kitchen counter, she felt the heavy thudding of her heart reminding her that life was passing her by. At that moment, she did not know that her first steps toward freedom had already been taken, and that a meeting with the unknown would become merely a matter of days. A light rain had started in the morning, and a cool haze enveloped the streets, but Rebecca decided not to cancel the spontaneously formed habit of morning walks. With each day, she felt less desire to remain in the quiet setting of the house, where everything looked perfect only at first glance. It was as though she was drawn outside, where life followed its own course and did not require immaculate order. Throwing on a windbreaker, she left the house. In such weather, the park was usually empty, and Rebecca hoped to find some tranquility there to calm her troubled thoughts. Running random bits of thought through her head, she simultaneously tried to concentrate on a light jog. As she approached the familiar bench by the pond, she noticed a figure standing nearby under the low branches of a tree. A young man who looked a bit over 20 was leaning on the back of the bench and gazing thoughtfully at the water. In his hands, he held a water bottle. He was dressed in sportswear. Apparently, he too had come to run. Rebecca intended to pass by without stopping, but he suddenly noticed her, gave a slight smile, and nodded in greeting. She returned a brief, polite smile. Inside, something gave a stir. For many months, she was not used to random passers-by looking at her so genuinely, much less with friendliness. "Good morning," he said quietly, taking a step forward. His voice sounded calm, with no trace of shyness. "Morning," she replied, trying not to appear embarrassed. They fell silent for a second. Rebecca was about to continue on her way, but the stranger suddenly smiled wider. "I'm Ethan," he introduced himself, giving a quick nod at their surroundings. "Great place for a run, isn't it?" The tone of his voice was warm, friendly, without any hint of pushiness. Rebecca realized she hadn't had a casual chat with a stranger in a long time. She was even surprised how instantly it caused a slight excitement in her. "Yes, I love this park," she answered. "I'm Rebecca." "Nice to meet you, Rebecca," Ethan responded, glancing up at the somewhat grim sky. "I was hoping the rain wouldn't catch me mid-run, but it looks like it might start dripping again soon." Rebecca also looked at the gray clouds. Suddenly, she found herself wanting to linger in this chance conversation, a break in the monotony of her morning. She moved a step closer to the bench, placing one foot on the wooden rung, stretching the muscles in her leg to mask her inner awkwardness. "Yes, the weather's been changeable," she muttered, "but I like these early hours. Hardly anyone around, so you can be alone with your thoughts." "True," Ethan agreed. "Sometimes you just want to escape the city noise. Everything feels simpler here." He briefly looked away as though considering something. "Do you come here often?" "You" was how he addressed her, which surprised Rebecca, and simultaneously she registered his politeness. "Only recently," she admitted. "I used to never find the time. How about you? Or, how about you?" She hesitated, unsure how best to address him. Ethan smirked and looked around somewhat bashfully. Well, we're in America, so we can be casual, he said, lowering his voice so as not to embarrass her. I also only recently discovered this park. I moved to this town a couple of months ago, decided to run in the morning so I wouldn't lose shape. He said it lightly, unpretentious, and Rebecca sensed that a certain trusting resonance was arising between them. For the last couple of years, she rarely encountered people who smiled and interacted so openly, not turning away to check their phone. After a short pause, she smiled back. Moved from far away? From another state, he nodded, turning his eyes to the pond. Work forced me. I thought it would be boring, but the town turned out all right. People, mostly friendly. Then he looked at her again and added, Glad I found this park. Now I'm meeting pleasant folks here. Suddenly, Rebecca's heart skipped. Pleasant folks? He likely didn't mean it deliberately, but for some reason it touched her. Without intending to, she felt a slight warmth spreading inside. Am I really that unaccustomed to simple friendly remarks? The thought flashed. Mustering her nerve, she decided it was time to end the conversation, afraid that another minute, and he'd notice she was blushing. Well, nice to meet you, Ethan, she said politely, taking a step back. I should go, I guess. Sure, he replied, noticing her embarrassment. Have a great day. Maybe we'll run into each other again. It's a small park. Maybe, she responded with a gentle smile. And indeed, she had no idea why a tiny spark of joy flared up inside her. As she left, Rebecca tried not to look back, but at the last moment she stole a glance. Ethan stood, his neck craned slightly, looking in her direction and smiling. She immediately turned away, feeling a pleasant shiver. A random encounter, she told herself, nothing more. But why did her heart race as if she'd done something forbidden? The way home felt shorter than usual. Although her legs were tired, she was buzzing with excitement. For one thing, she didn't feel guilty about Michael. This meeting was just a brief chat with a guy in the park, nothing inappropriate. And secondly, for the first time in so long, Rebecca felt her day had begun not with gray silence, but with fresh air, a genuine glance, and the light laughter of a stranger. Opening the door, she found the house just as it had been. Impeccable cleanliness. On the table, her planner, and a note from Michael saying he'd have to stay late at work. Before, such notes provoked mild annoyance. Now, strangely, she didn't mind them at all. Maybe she had grown used to her husband's absence most of the day, or maybe she had discovered a little warmth in recalling her conversation with Ethan. Checking the time, Rebecca wondered, what should I do now? Ordinary chores around the house suddenly lost their importance. She pictured telling Michael about her morning run, but it was as though she saw his indifference, a brief nod, and then more silence. Why not do something I've long wanted to do? A daring thought arose. She remembered the psychology books she'd bought a year ago that remained unread. Today she was free all day. She might go to the city library and see if they have something interesting on art therapy. The idea seemed almost adventurous. Just leave the house, as if that were something unusual. Putting the art therapy book in her bag, Rebecca felt ever more strongly that her life was gradually yet irresistibly shifting from a dead point. Though she couldn't foresee where it would lead, she had no choice but to follow this strange feeling of inner awakening. In the afternoon, wandering the library halls, leafing through the pages of inspiring books, Rebecca suddenly recalled Ethan's smile. She even let out a light laugh, unintentionally in the hushed atmosphere. Feeling the librarian's startled gaze, she excused herself and drifted off into thoughts again. Should I go running in the park tomorrow too? The idea seemed strange, yet pleasant. For some reason, she felt that seeing Ethan again, there would be like a new breath of freedom. By evening, returning home, she slowed down near a storefront displaying small paintings by local artists. The colors looked bold and vivid, painted with a free manner. Artists, she thought, recalling how she herself once tried painting. A long time ago, before meeting Michael. Even so, her drawings hadn't been particularly skillful, but she loved the process, like a scrap of a dream touching her memory. What if I take up creativity again? Even just for myself, not for any show. She went into the shop, purchased inexpensive acrylic paints, brushes, and a modest set of canvases. This decision was as spontaneous as her urge to jog in the mornings. Still inside, she sensed a wave of lightness, like someone removing the covering from her soul, long gathering dust on a shelf. For dinner, Rebecca prepared a simple pasta, and while waiting for Michael, she decided to read the Psychology of Creativity book. But her husband didn't come home at the usual time. At 10 o'clock, he texted that he would spend the night in a neighboring town because of prolonged negotiations. Reading that short message, Rebecca felt no disappointment. Usually, when Michael stayed out, she'd feel anxious, suspecting something's off. Now she simply put down her phone and sat before a blank canvas. She quietly smiled. Maybe I've finally freed myself from this endless emptiness. By midnight, she had already made some clumsy strokes. Nothing special, but the process captivated her. In the hazy lamplight, images from memory floated up. How light glitters on green leaves in the park. How the damp path sparkles under her running shoes. How Ethan's face, when he smiles, looks more alive than anything she's seen in years. Those moments converged into her first abstract painting, far from perfect, but filled with a quiet hope. Setting her brush aside, she saw it was almost 1 a.m. She stretched tiredly, but didn't feel that old senseless fatigue. There was a sense of inspiration. Well, let's see where this path will lead me, she thought, heading to the bedroom. Tomorrow morning promised another run, and possibly a new meeting with unpredictable changes. Morning once again greeted Rebecca with a gloomy sky, but now she refused to let her mood depend on the weather. At around 7 o'clock, she quickly got ready and went to the park. The place where, for the last couple of days, she had found that inexplicable sense of freedom. On her way, she kept thinking, what if I see Ethan again? However, inside she wrestled with mixed feelings, a faint anticipation, a fear of revealing she was hoping to meet him, and a hidden guilt about Michael. She felt that each desire to experience something new automatically questioned her entire marriage. But if before she allowed only fleeting fantasies, now the thought of the park and a possible conversation with Ethan had become nearly obsessive. Once she stepped onto the soft gravel path, she felt the usual excitement. She first made a short round, warming up with a light jog. The tall trees, not yet fully leafed, let through the gray light. Clearly, no sunshine would appear today. Soon she approached the pond's bench where she had stopped previously, looked around, and saw no sign of Ethan. For some reason, she felt a slight sting of resentment, as though he promised to be there, though of course there was no promise. How silly I am, Rebecca scolded herself sitting down. She closed her eyes, attempting to calm down, calling on reasoned logic. We've only spoken a couple of times. He's just a polite guy. Even so, her heart tightened in disappointment. Suddenly behind her, the sound of footsteps, someone running on the path. She turned sharply. It was an unfamiliar elderly man in a tracksuit. After a quick assessment, she realized it wasn't the one she was hoping for. Really, is she hoping? The thought filled her with embarrassment. Don't behave like this, she firmly told herself. Nobody made me any promises, and here I am acting like a heroine in a cheap novel. Gathering herself, she stood. It's time to go home, or the day will be wasted. Yet literally a minute later, as she was leaving the park, a familiar silhouette emerged from around the bend. Ethan hurrying toward her, clutching his water bottle. At the sight of Rebecca, his face lit up with a smile. Hey, he called, slowing his run. His breathing was a bit ragged. Evidently, he'd had a good workout. I was afraid I'd miss your run today. Rebecca's heart skipped cheerfully. She felt her face flush. Trying to hide her excitement, she smiled in return. Hi, Ethan. Looks like you went at it pretty hard. Yeah, he sighed, lightly wiping his brow with a towel. I was sure that if I didn't get here by 8, I wouldn't catch you. The remark came out so natural, like they were old friends. Rebecca felt warmth inside. Someone actually cares about making sure they see her. At the same time, she worried how it might look. I'm a grown woman. I have a husband, she reminded herself, but instantly drove those anxious thoughts away. All done? Heading off? Ethan asked, noticing her posture as if she was about to leave. Yes, I thought I wouldn't see you today, she admitted, then bit her tongue, realizing how frank it sounded. Ethan smiled, as if sensing her embarrassment, but not teasing her about it. Maybe we can sit for a minute over there on the bench, he suggested, before we go off for the day. Rebecca hesitated, her mind swiftly scanning excuses. I'm in a hurry, I have housework. But her lips responded, all right. They went to a nearby bench under a maple tree. Sitting down, they felt the slight smell of damp bark and the gentle sound of rain droplets on the leaves. The early chill was unusual, yet Rebecca found a curious comfort in the half-lit atmosphere. How have your last few days been? Ethan asked in a friendly tone. You mentioned you rarely used to run, but now you seem to have gotten into it? Rebecca smiled. Yeah, I like this sense of freedom. I'm just trying to get out of my usual routine. The word routine carried a bitterness. Ethan noticed the change in her voice. I understand, he nodded, not prying. I was running from monotony myself when I decided to move here. Though a lot of stuff is tough, there's a zest for life when you try something new. They fell silent for a few seconds, looking at the pond. Right at that moment, a few ducks noisily took off from the water, leaving ripples behind. Rebecca observed how beautifully the light reflected in those ripples and suddenly realized the same disturbance of calm was happening in her soul. Michael had never provoked anything like this, unlike this almost stranger who, in just a few conversations, had awakened her emotions. So what do you do in town? She finally asked, trying to steer the conversation to neutral topics. Ethan replied he was involved in commercial real estate and that everything was new to him but exciting. He mentioned a few projects he's overseeing. Rebecca listened, nodding, and internally marveled. So young, and already such ambitions. How about you? He unexpectedly asked. You haven't told me about yourself. Are you working, or? Rebecca dropped her gaze. I'm afraid my answer will sound boring, she thought, but out loud she said, I'm a homemaker. I used to plan on returning to painting, but somehow kept putting it off. Now there's a husband, a house, everyday life. Speaking it aloud, she felt it sounded like an excuse. Ethan gave her a particularly gentle smile. Being a homemaker isn't easy either, but if you feel like painting, why not go back to it? In his tone, there was no hint of judgment or condescension. Rather, he seemed surprised she didn't allow herself that creative outlet. Rebecca felt her heart tighten with gratitude. How little it takes to feel the support I've lacked for so long. Maybe I will, she whispered, averting her eyes. Then glancing at the time, she realized she'd spent quite a while there. Sorry, I have to go. Ethan stood with her, carefully putting his water bottle into his backpack. I also have plans, but I hope we'll see each other again. She nodded, trying to remain calm. Maybe tomorrow. Upon hearing this, Ethan smiled. Gladly. As Rebecca walked home, she caught herself smiling for no reason. But crossing the threshold, her bright feelings collided with the silent expanse of the large living room. In her mind echoed, my God, what am I doing? This is wrong. Or, that afternoon, Michael called only once, briefly clarifying something about their finances, then hung up. That evening, he was late again, texting a brief message. Rebecca agonized. Should she tell him she'd started running? That she met someone new? Yet she felt her husband wouldn't think much of it. He typically dismissed her personal interests. Do what you like, as long as it doesn't affect the house. That evening passed in heavy thoughts. Rebecca sat before the canvas she had begun coloring the night before. But her brush wouldn't obey. She kept seeing Ethan's face, his kindly glances, his easy manner of talking. There had been no such friendly chats with Michael for ages. Maybe we both drifted apart? Around midnight, she tried to sleep, but tossed and turned, her mind spinning. Can I handle this? Am I betraying Michael? Betraying our past? But nothing's happened. Eventually, she decided she would simply keep meeting Ethan until she figured out the direction. After all, she had never vowed not to befriend other people. The next couple of days tested her resolve. She saw Ethan in the park, each meeting stretching into small, heartfelt conversations. She learned about his family, his passion for running marathons, how in college he used to draw posters but never pursued the skill professionally. It amused her that she too once dreamed of painting professionally. But alongside the warmth of these new acquaintances, an internal struggle was growing. On one hand, she lived an ordinary life, keeping the house tidy, shopping, cooking dinners, waiting for her husband. On the other, she eagerly awaited morning to go out and find Ethan again. She suspected she was no longer merely enjoying the friendship but developing deeper feelings. This alarmed her. One evening, Michael noticed Rebecca had become busier and asked where she went each morning. She briefly answered, "I'm running in the park." He just nodded without much interest. "Good for you." No further questions. She felt a sting of his indifference. Doesn't it matter I have new habits, a new circle of contact? She stayed silent, afraid of triggering a confrontation she wasn't ready for. Gradually, Rebecca became aware of how much she wanted to be out of the house. The coziness that used to be her fortress now felt like a room with faded wallpaper. Every time she was near Ethan, the world blazed with living colors. Returning to routine and silent dinners with Michael made those colors fade. Inside her, anxiety rose. How long can I lead this double life? In her heart, she already knew these meetings with Ethan were no longer mere friendship. Meanwhile, Michael kept immersing himself in work, arriving home late, speaking barely about anything except news and next week's plans. On a sunny day, when Rebecca and Ethan decided to sit in a small outdoor cafe, for the first time they went somewhere together outside the park, she was struck by the sincere warmth in his gaze. Her throat went dry, heart pounded. For the first time in years, it felt incredibly good that someone directly cared about her thoughts, truly listened, laughed at her anecdotes, showed support. Returning home, she sat by the kitchen window, hugging her knees, and suddenly burst into tears, surprised at herself. What's wrong with me? The guilt toward her husband gnawed at her, but she was also upset that she lacked the emotions she now experienced with a complete stranger. Could it all be chalked up to just friendly talks? She realized something bigger was at stake, possibly her entire life. Thus, in Rebecca's soul, a tight knot formed. She couldn't just leave the familiar marriage, for Michael had never done her any harm. He was a good man, providing stability, never raising his voice or criticizing. But why then did she feel so empty near him? Why did she yearn to escape to the park, warmed by Ethan's smile? By the end of the week, the tension peaked. A small incident occurred. Michael came home and saw that Rebecca had left some new sketches on the table. She was trying to paint again, recalling her youth. He glanced at them, said nothing, then quietly remarked, "Oh, you decided to mess around again?" and went to his study, failing to see how hurt her expression became. That single word, messing around, stung like an insult. She then locked herself in the bathroom, stood under the shower with clenched fists. It was clear to her that Michael didn't even care what was happening with her. He regarded her efforts as a trivial hobby. This was not the first time. Hence, she herself would have to decide what she wanted. But feeling that stinging awareness, she realized their paths might be diverging more than she was ready to admit. So those days continued, bright, fresh emotions in the park, where adrenaline and warmth pulsed, and at home, a growing estrangement. Rebecca understood that soon she'd have to choose, and that thought frightened her. Just a few brief encounters had reawakened something that had lain dormant for years. She wanted happiness, true happiness, not a polished facade. But how to tell Michael? How to know whether to destroy the old life for a chance at a new one? Deep down, she sensed the point of no return was near. The scariest part was that she faced this conflict alone. Michael seemed unaware, and Ethan apparently didn't want to push. So more and more often, the question haunted her. Should I keep running to the park? Keep up this dangerous game? But each morning she realized, yes, she did want to go. And conversely, each evening at dinner with Michael, she caught herself thinking, we're strangers. I don't know if there's a way back. The day that was supposed to change everything started deceptively calmly. Rebecca woke before dawn. Faint stripes of light fell on the perfectly made bed, but now that perfection felt uncomfortable. She lay awake for several minutes, listening to her own breath and heartbeat, recalling the previous evening, Michael's thoughtless comment about messing around. Tears nearly rose at the memory of his dismissive attitude toward her attempt at creativity. She shut her eyes and whispered almost silently, "Today I have to decide something." She herself didn't know what she meant, Possibly she just realized she couldn't live in such tension any longer. On one hand, a husband who seemingly didn't care. On the other, a strange but irresistible sense of freedom associated with her walks, painting, and conversations with Ethan. And between these extremes lay her fear. Fear of losing the security she once chose. That morning, as always, Michael was already drinking coffee, engrossed in the news on his tablet. He gave her a quick glance, casually asked, "You got up early," and sank back into the screen. Rebecca felt once again that she craved at least the slightest emotional exchange or conversation. Yet feeling hopeless, she poured herself coffee in silence. The black liquid tasted bitter, and she suddenly realized how annoyed she was by that empty morning routine. I'm going to the park again today," she said quietly, as if testing whether he would react. Michael nodded without lifting his eyes. "All right, go ahead. It's good for your health." And that was it. No interest, no questions about who you spend time with. Do you like it? Shall we run together? Nothing. Rebecca suddenly felt an upsurge of determination. I deserve more. This is not life, but an illusion. She went to the park as in previous days, trying to keep her head high, not letting her inner monologue distract her. Yet 2 blocks from her destination, her heart began beating faster. Would Ethan come today? Maybe he was busy. She wondered if he was just as eager to see her as she was him. Upon entering the park, she caught the faint fragrance of yesterday's rain mixed with wet earth. Most of all, she wanted to immediately spot that familiar shape. Approaching her favorite bench, she found it empty. No Ethan. On the path, a woman with a dog passed by, and an older man on a bicycle. Rebecca dejectedly sat and wrapped her arms around her shoulders. The cold was palpable, and inside she felt gloom. All right then, she said out loud to herself. I'll run alone. She made a full circuit, trying to distract from oppressive thoughts. Deep inside, though, she knew how one small sign of attention from Ethan was a beam of light, while his absence undermined her self-esteem. Look at how I've become reliant on the favor of basically a stranger, she thought in chagrin. Stopping by the pond, breathing heavily from her brisk run, she watched the breeze ruffle small ripples and waves on the water. Suddenly she heard a familiar voice behind her. Sorry, I'm late. Got stuck in traffic on the way. Spinning around, Rebecca saw Ethan. He was looking at her with both an apologetic and delighted smile. He wore a sporty jacket. Car keys peeked from a pocket. Evidently, he didn't live close by, but had driven over for a run. That's all right, she responded a bit too quickly, surprised by how relieved she sounded. I thought maybe you weren't coming today. I was afraid I wouldn't catch you, he admitted, a note of warm sincerity in his voice. Glad you're here. His simple remark, glad you're here, unleashed a surge of feelings in her. She wanted to believe it was more than politeness. Why do I feel alive with him? She wondered. Maybe I found someone who can truly listen. Together they completed a few laps on the path, occasionally exchanging short remarks and friendly jokes. Ethan didn't ask why her eyes looked sad, but he observed her as if ready to listen. Soon they paused under the sprawling maple tree, catching their breath. Ethan's face glowed slightly pink, clearly happy to be there, while Rebecca tried to hide the trembling in her knees that could no longer be attributed to mere fatigue. How's your day? He finally asked. Any plans? She gave a wry smile, dropping her gaze. No special plans. The house, cooking, cleaning, my husband always busy. Saying this, she felt ashamed, as if she were already revealing too many details of her personal life to someone she barely knew. Yet Ethan listened intently, with not a speck of judgment. If you like, we can meet for coffee sometime. Not in the park, he suggested carefully. Just to talk if you need to get things off your chest. Hearing this, Rebecca inwardly recoiled in fear. That's more than a casual run, her conscience warned. Yet another part of her shouted that she had longed for genuine human warmth and understanding. Maybe, she whispered, not daring to meet his eyes. I'll think about it. I don't want to put you in an awkward position, he added gently. It's just that you strike me as someone with depth, and inside, there's pain. I'm good at listening. His simple, kind words nearly made her break down in tears. My God, are there really people out there who genuinely care about how I feel? Flashed in her mind. She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. At home, the contrast was stark. As soon as she opened the door, it was as if a gray wall pressed down on her. Before noon, Michael sent a text. Don't wait for dinner. We've got a meeting until late. She tossed her phone onto the couch and went into the kitchen. Immaculate. Empty. The silence felt oppressive to her ears. Feeling unwilling to remain alone in that void, Rebecca practically fled the house, deciding, at least I'll go to the store and mingle among people. But even while shopping, she couldn't stop replaying Ethan's words. Just talk if you need to get things off your chest. Didn't she have the right to talk? To be understood? The rest of the day was spent in an inner tug-of-war. One side of her mind whispered, careful, you're playing with fire. This could become an affair. Yet the other side recognized, how can it be an affair when it merely grants her the right to feel? And why doesn't Michael see her pain? That evening, she sat with her paints, attempting to create another piece, an abstract swirl of ominous, dark blues like stormy water. Almost instinctively, a woman's silhouette emerged from the depths, as though she were drowning in gray waves. Stepping back, Rebecca realized it depicted herself. It frightened her, yet it felt like the truth of her soul. The next morning, as usual, Michael didn't notice the painting on the easel by the window. He gave her a quick kiss on the cheek, grabbed his briefcase, and left. Rebecca watched him go, and then felt a cold clarity. If she didn't brave an honest conversation, she'd continue this torturous double life. And that conversation was inevitable. Sooner or later, Michael might suspect her unusual mood. Besides, she no longer wanted to lie to her husband every day. Meanwhile, Ethan kept sending her occasional messages. How are you? You okay? And she replied carefully, trying not to spark gossip, but his genuine concern warmed her. Deep down, she knew. We're not just acquaintances. Is this friendship? The beginning of something more? I'm not sure, but I want this connection. Rising tension reached its peak that evening when Michael abruptly came home a couple hours early. He hadn't said he'd be done, and walked in while Rebecca was in the living room, scrolling through messages with Ethan. From outside, she heard the car, and suddenly her husband was at the door. She threw her phone aside, her heart lurching. Hi, Michael said curtly. I decided to come back earlier. Thought we could have dinner together. It sounded almost caring, but his tone was tense. Rebecca sensed something was off. He looked at the table where her phone lay, then looked at her. You haven't been home in the mornings lately, often come back later. Everything all right? She flushed. Come back later? He had no idea about her new habits. And hadn't he previously been fine with her being busy? But Michael's voice betrayed hidden resentment. I'm just running in the mornings, sometimes stopping in town. She tried to speak calmly. What's wrong with that? Nothing. Michael narrowed his eyes. I just noticed changes. You don't say anything, you disappear. Maybe there's something important I should know? Rebecca felt her resentment rising. Was he suspecting her? Yet he himself never showed a trace of interest, only now posing questions. When did you ever care what I do? She blurted, for the first time in a long time, using a harsh tone. You bury yourself in work, and I in the house. Now I'm just trying to bring some spark into my days. Is that a crime? Michael frowned, raising an eyebrow. I never said it was a crime. But your tone… What's going on, Rebecca? You're upset. Yes, I'm upset, she admitted, fists clenched. Because you don't notice me. You don't care if I have interests or who I talk to. And now suddenly you're asking, like you're jealous? He exhaled heavily, shifting his gaze. Jealous? Maybe. I just feel I'm becoming irrelevant to you. You're pulling away. Finally, honesty. But Rebecca realized she could no longer hold back. Gathering her courage, she said, maybe you are irrelevant. Or maybe I'm irrelevant in your schedule. Silence filled the room, so thick it felt like thunder before a storm. Michael stared at her, stunned. So that's what you think? I don't know what to think, Michael, she replied bitterly. But inside me there's so much emptiness. I'm not sure if there's anything left between us besides habit. His posture stiffened. his eyes showing a mix of shock and hurt. Possibly, for the first time, he realized Rebecca was truly unhappy, not just a silent, perfect homemaker. Instead of comfort or confession, he merely pressed his lips tight and said, "If there's someone else, just tell me straight." She gasped as though he'd slapped her. "Someone else? That's all you can think of? Maybe it's that we've simply become strangers. I—" Her voice caught. Michael seemed torn between anger and confusion. "You never gave me any reason to doubt you. But now, I sense something's going on behind my back." Rebecca covered her face with her hands. Deep down, she knew. Physically, she hadn't cheated, but she felt like a traitor. Yet what betrayal, that she was finally searching for meaning in her life? "If you want to know, yes, I met a person. But there's nothing," she began, trembling with nerves. "I just needed warmth." The silence hardened, and the air was filled with more questions than answers. Michael lowered his gaze to the floor. "Fine. I need time to think." With that, he turned and left the room, leaving her alone. Rebecca stood there, knees trembling. It seemed that the point of no return had arrived. She openly admitted she lacked his attention, that another man gave her missing warmth. In that moment, she had no idea how that truth would play out, but she knew now everything would be different. There was no going back to the old silent harmony. Tears welled in her eyes, her heart aching and tightening. Yet beneath the pain, a spark of relief flared. "I said it. I broke through the wall. Yes, it's scary, but now I'm not stuck." Without even changing, she grabbed her phone and went outside for a walk. She went to that same park where she usually ran in the mornings, not caring if it was day or night. Twilight was falling, the final glimmers of sunset filtering through the treetops. Hardly anyone was around besides perhaps a security guard at the entrance. On autopilot, she reached the familiar bench by the pond and sat down, hugging her arms around her shoulders. It was chilly and her head spun with thoughts. She wanted to call Ethan, to share, but sensed that might push her deeper into that budding closeness beyond mere friendship. Though had she not in fact decided already? The house behind her was crumbling. Her gaze fell on the reflection in the water. "I don't want to live by someone else's script anymore. I have the right to be happy," she repeated inwardly. All that remained was to figure out exactly how she would claim that right, and whether she dared risk everything for something real. The day evidently ended with no chance of returning to the old ways. Morning wasn't just gloomy, it felt thick with heaviness after their talk the night before. Michael silently got ready for work. His face maintained its usual composure, but now it was icy and distant. Not a single word was spoken by either spouse. Once he left, Rebecca sat on the couch for a long while, staring at the closed door, feeling a hollow echo in her chest. Well, that's that, she thought, realizing how last night's chasm of honesty couldn't be disguised by polite indifference. In some way, they both acknowledged the reality. Their marriage was fractured. Now all that was left was taking the next step. To avoid going insane in the empty house, Rebecca stepped outside again, heading to the park. Not to run, she just needed coolness and a bit of silence accompanied by the sound of the wind. Halfway there, she walked in a daze, her mind repeating the same question. "I'm no longer lying, but does that solve anything? Michael knows I'm unhappy. He asked if there's someone else. Is there?" Certainly, someone else had entered her life, Ethan. But can you call it truly someone if so far it's been just supportive chats, empathy, and a jolt of emotion? Or maybe the essence of an affair is emotional closeness, more painful than any physical betrayal? She was strolling along the path, not noticing the figures in the distance, when suddenly she heard that familiar voice. "Hey, Rebecca, how are you?" She startled and turned. Ethan stood there, slightly raising his hand in greeting. On his face was no usual wide smile, but a hint of worry. Evidently, he instantly sensed she was distressed. "Hi," she managed, stepping closer. Still, just seeing him made her feel that sense of warmth. Not so great. Could we talk a bit?" Ethan nodded without further questions and led her toward a bench near the tree line. The springtime leaves, though it felt like autumn in her soul, softly rustled underfoot, and Rebecca tried to gather her scattered thoughts. They sat, and he leaned back, studying her face. Is everything okay? You look very upset. Instead of answering, Rebecca felt a lump form in her throat. Tears suddenly rose, though she struggled not to cry openly. Ethan hesitantly reached out his hand, as if to take hers, but worried about pushing too far. She finally spoke quietly. I told my husband I'm unhappy, that something's wrong in my life, and he suspects me of cheating. And I partly realized that emotionally. I've already left him. Saying it, Rebecca realized how close she was to revealing to Ethan what he meant to her, but she was afraid to speak. You are the one giving me support. She hadn't even sorted it all out herself. Ethan frowned slightly, lowering his gaze sadly. I never wanted to cause problems in your marriage. The problems existed before, she broke in firmly. I only notice them now because your advice, your talks, your warmth. She trailed off, wary of saying too much. Ethan frowned, deeper but kindly. I do care, Rebecca, but I don't want to force you or push you toward drastic decisions. You deserve to be happy, and only you can decide how. His words, only you can decide, coursed through her like a powerful wave. Yes, it was time for her to make the choice herself, rather than wait for Michael to change or for Ethan to make the first move. I don't know, she whispered, gripping the fabric of her windbreaker. I'm scared to destroy everything we built, but I also can't live in half-truths. I want to feel alive. After a short hesitation, Ethan placed his warm hand on hers. That simple gesture broke the dam. Tears flowed down Rebecca's cheeks. Though she tried not to sob openly, he squeezed her fingers consolingly, saying nothing extra. At that moment, he truly seemed like the one who could listen without judging. Answers won't come instantly, he said softly, but let it be your choice, without fearing judgment. If you need help, I'm here. Just promise not to lose yourself to other people's expectations. Rebecca's heart fluttered at his calm yet resolute tone. A sense of gratitude overwhelmed her. At last, someone was giving her the right to speak up, to be herself. Though she knew this meeting was growing increasingly dangerous, she wanted more than friendship. She could no longer, nor did she want to, stop it. Coming back home, Rebecca felt a unique mixture of fear and resolve. Facing Michael for a sincere talk seemed so hard, but that was precisely why she had started all this. For honesty. Summoning her courage, she took her phone and sent her husband a simple message. We need to talk tonight. Please come on time. His reply was concise. Okay, I'll try not to be late. All day she roamed the house as though in a cage, restless. What do I say? How will the conversation end? The questions chased each other. Closer to evening, she forced herself to take a piece of paper and at least privately outline. I'm unhappy. I need space. I want to change my life. And maybe us parting is for the best. When night fell, she lit the desk lamp in the living room and sat facing the front door, waiting for her husband. For the first time in all her married years, she wasn't afraid of a possible separation. She was more afraid of continuing a meaningless pretense. Around 9, she heard a car pull up. Michael came in, appearing tired, but there was also a certain resolve in him, mirroring hers. Removing his jacket, he placed it on a chair and looked at her. I'm listening. You wanted to talk. Rebecca swallowed, trying to hold his gaze. Yes. I think we have to lay it all out. We both feel we're no longer together like before. He hesitated, lowered his head, running a hand through his hair. What do you want to start with? That there's someone else in your life? Or that we ourselves let a lot slip? The words sounded harsh but not shouted, just pained. Rebecca flinched but said, I never said there's someone else. Honestly, I'm not having an affair, but I found a person who listens to me, who cares about my feelings, and we stopped sharing any emotions long ago. Michael clenched his jaw, closed his eyes for a moment, as though fighting anger or despair. Is it really that bad that you consider a stranger more important than talking to me? She wanted to protest that she'd tried talking 100 times yet found only coldness. Instead of accusations, she quietly said, I did try, But you never asked if I was happy. You were content if I just did the housewife role in silence. Eventually, I became a stranger in my own home. He inhaled deeply and sat in the armchair across from her. A minute of silence ensued, feeling like an eternity. So what now? He asked softly. You suggesting we split up? Rebecca felt her insides knot. Saying yes meant destroying a marriage, stepping knowingly into the unknown. But to stay silent meant maintaining the illusion. I don't know. Maybe we can live separately for a while. Figure out if we have any feelings left. Or if we continue together, it must be somehow different. She feared her own boldness. But Michael didn't start a fight. He just closed his eyes as though in acute pain. Then slowly, quietly responded, You know, Cass. He used the pet name for the first time in ages. I realize that for months now I've sort of given up, drowned in work, and now I'm not sure if it can be turned back. A note of weariness, mixed with sad acceptance, sounded in his voice. Rebecca felt relief in knowing her feelings weren't imaginary. Michael, too, knew how far apart they had drifted. I don't want to hurt you, she admitted sincerely. I'm sorry if this seems harsh, but I can't keep silent anymore. He was silent for a while, seemingly searching for words. Finally, he nodded. Let's take a breath and calm down. Maybe we do need a break. Honestly, I don't know how to go on, but I feel if we keep pretending, it'll get worse. Tears pricked Rebecca's eyes. He's not fighting, and I'm not fighting, she realized. On the one hand, it hurt less than she expected. No explosive showdown. On the other hand, there was no attempt to reignite their spark. Possibly they were both exhausted, so their frank talk ended in those words. From that moment, everything led to what they called living separately and time to think. In essence, a farewell. Michael decided to move closer to his office for a couple of weeks, citing convenience. Rebecca saw that he was giving her freedom and giving himself a pause from awkward cohabitation. When he left, she sank onto the floor right in the hallway. The thick silence of the house felt different now. Not a fraudulent harmony, but clarity. We decided to separate, at least temporarily, and now it's up to me. She remained there for about 20 minutes, feeling a ringing in her ears. Then she realized she needed someone to confide in after such a conversation. Instantly, she thought of Ethan, but hesitated to rush straight to him the same minute she split from her husband. That would be too soon, and I'm afraid it looks like escaping right into another's arms. Still, the thought of him became a ray of hope. Maybe not as a lover, but as someone who showed her that joy and personal freedom still existed. I must proceed carefully, slowly, she kept telling herself, the phone in her lap. Yet she already sensed she would seek Ethan's presence, for she was stripped of her old shield, and she needed understanding in her new life. So she stayed like that for about 20 minutes before finding the strength to stand and go to the room with her easel. Opening the paint jars, Rebecca started applying strokes, not trying for any form but spilling out that painful mix of resentment, relief, and anticipation. It turned out chaotic, oddly expressive, a dark background flecked with bright bursts. She wanted to label it a fracture, but not an end. After all, everything seemed only beginning. All that was left was to take another step and allow herself to live for her own sake, and possibly for the chance at new feelings that had so rashly and inevitably sprouted through the shadow of her old life. The warm spring sunshine gently filtered through the windows of the apartment Rebecca now called her new home. The small, bright rooms were not yet fully furnished, and she didn't have much stuff. She'd moved out just days ago, renting a cozy place on the outskirts of town. Michael's house was left behind, along with its endless sense of a perfect cage. She still hadn't formalized the divorce, but they agreed to live separately, giving each other the space they'd lacked so badly. Rebecca sat on a small poof in the living room, hugging her knees. Boxes of her belongings lay scattered about, and in the corner stood her now familiar easel. Over the recent weeks, painting had become not just a hobby, but a way to release all her pent-up emotions. From the pain of disappointments to the quiet joy brought on by everyday freedom. In this apartment, she could still smell fresh wall paint and masking tape, not expensive room fresheners or polished furniture. Yet she felt she could truly breathe here. There was a knock at the door. With a slight worry but also a gentle thrill, she got up and straightened her hair. On the threshold stood Ethan, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. Not the most luxurious, but all the more touching. He gave a slightly shy smile. "Hey, I thought maybe your new place could use a little splash of spring color." Rebecca's heart constricted with tenderness. Not so long ago, she couldn't imagine receiving flowers from someone she wouldn't have even called a friend. Now he felt like the closest person in spirit. "Thanks," she replied, trying to hide her surge of joy. "Come in, but be warned. There's still chaos." Ethan chuckled and entered, looking around at the boxes. "Chaos is a normal part of change. I had to start from scratch too when I moved here." He handed her the flowers. "Right now, all the chaos sets the stage for something new, right?" Rebecca nodded, taking the bouquet and breathing in its fresh, gentle scent that perfectly captured her mood. Leading him to the small kitchen table, consisting of folding chairs and a decent IKEA table, she filled a makeshift vase with water, a simple jar. "How's settling in?" Ethan asked, noticing that aside from a Spartan set of furniture, there were only a couple of bookshelves and the easel. "Not quite yet," she admitted, tucking her hair behind her ear. "But I like empty walls. I can fill them with my drawings, my ideas." They both laughed. For the first time in ages, Rebecca heard her own laugh ring out, not forced, but light and free. Ethan gazed at her with respect. "Glad you're doing what you want," he said quietly. "How's Michael? Have you talked since then?" Rebecca felt a pang of sadness. In spite of her sense of liberation, she wasn't angry at Michael. She regretted that their paths diverged, but perhaps it was necessary so each could find real happiness. Briefly, she shrugged, he found a temporary place near work. "We're not rushing with the legalities, but we know we probably won't be together. It's tough, but at the same time, it's right." Ethan nodded. He didn't show the triumphant spark people sometimes do when they've won out over a rival. He looked serious, empathetic. Wordlessly, he took a small envelope from his pocket. "I've got something for you. Not exactly a present, just I came across an art forum that's hosting an evening of open painting. Thought you might be interested." Rebecca gently took the envelope. Inside was a flyer reading, "Open Studio, an evening of free creative work, free to join." The vibe was that amateurs and pros gather to paint together and share ideas. "Oh, wow!" Her heart beat faster. "I never knew we had something like that in town." "I was surprised too," Ethan smiled. "So I thought, why not check it out together if you like? Though I'll probably just watch and yawn in the corner, not being an artist, but I can be moral support." She smiled, her grin trembling with gratitude. Nobody had ever so sincerely offered, "I'm ready to step into your world and support you in your dreams." "Thank you," Rebecca whispered. "That means a lot." In the hush following those words, an unspoken weight hung. They stood in the dimly lit room, both aware this was more than chance friendship, but neither rushed to cross that delicate line. Maybe it was best to let events unfold naturally. Ethan helped her unpack a few boxes, chatting about mundane things, good local shops, where to buy what, how to arrange the space. Rebecca laughed at how clumsy they were, unwrapping dishes from paper, and suddenly realized that in this hour together, she felt more at ease and simpler than she had in the last several years of her life with Michael. By midday, Ethan suggested they grab lunch at a nearby cafe. Rebecca agreed, feeling that with each decision she said yes to a new life, a new self. She changed into a simple, light blouse, and glancing in the mirror, she no longer saw the stiff woman of old, but someone ready for change. At the small, quiet cafe, they took a table by the window. They ordered coffee, and Ethan listened closely as Rebecca shared the details of her final conversation with Michael. Of course, she kept some emotions to herself. Who wants to lay out all the pain? But Ethan didn't rush or pry. "You know, if you decide you want to go back to him, that's your choice," he said suddenly, trying to speak steadily, though his voice wavered. "I don't want you feeling as if I'm pressuring you to leave your husband." Rebecca noticed his fingers tapping the table anxiously and felt a wave of tenderness. He didn't want to be the cause of her divorce. He just was there in her life. And she realized she had no desire to go back to the marriage. for it had been stifling her inside. "To be honest, I don't see a way back," she said calmly, "and I don't want to go there. Sure, I'll be grieving this loss for a while, but I'm not going to give myself up again." He nodded and understanding appeared in his eyes. They both sipped their coffee, a relaxed pause free from hurry, yet lightly joyous. They no longer had to hide so much. "Maybe I'll need time to recover from all this drama," Rebecca admitted. "But Ethan, I'm glad you're here." He smiled, not hiding the fact that her words made him happy. "I'm glad to be here too," he said quietly, "and I promise not to rush you." The next day, Rebecca immersed herself in arranging the apartment. Later, she phoned Michael to clarify a few bank details. The conversation was dry, informal, but without that old sharp pain. She felt they had concluded the chapter of their relationship as spouses. Now it was just a matter of official paperwork, once each was ready. Michael said he'd stay temporarily in rented lodgings and would ask a lawyer to prep the documents. At the end of the call, he quietly added, "I'm sorry I never noticed how bad you felt. I hope things turn out well for you." Rebecca thanked him and, placing down the phone, spent a few minutes in silence, letting the sadness of parting wash over her. Then suddenly she felt lighter. Thus ended the agonizing days of uncertainty. She chose a path full of risk, lacking a guaranteed happy ending, but it was her choice, her decision to be true to herself. That weekend, Ethan called. "So, how about that open painting night?" Nervously, Rebecca laughed. "Yes, let's do it." They went together to a small art space where about a dozen people were gathered with brushes and paints. At first, Rebecca was self-conscious. She hadn't painted seriously in ages, but the atmosphere was welcoming. Everyone encouraged each other, exchanging tips. Ethan patiently sat nearby, watching her immerse herself. Quiet conversation and soft music filled the room. She felt the familiar sense of flight as paint glided onto the white canvas, creating color and form. This time she produced a bright landscape, perhaps subconsciously capturing that park where her journey to freedom had begun. When the event ended, they stepped out into a cool night. The air was crisp, and the reflection of stars shimmered in puddles left by rain. Ethan carried her canvas, holding it carefully so as not to smear the paint. Rebecca smiled, basking in pleasant tiredness. "Thanks for this, and for everything," she said softly, stopping under a streetlight. "I don't know how it will all go, but let's not make strict plans," he answered, stopping beside her. "We'll take it one step at a time." Rebecca looked into his eyes. In that light, she saw something she longed to feel: sincere gentleness and respect for who she was. She took a small step forward and felt Ethan likewise lean closer. In the sudden hush, they stood inches apart. She raised her hand, barely touching his cheek. Ethan, somewhat shyly, placed his hand at her waist. It was a brief moment that needed no words. She understood she might be acting recklessly, but inside she felt neither fear nor hesitation. Softly, almost imperceptibly, they came together, and her lips touched his in a first tentative kiss, filled with trembling and trust. The air hummed with the intensity of unspoken feelings that had not yet been declared, but had already happened. After they pulled back, Rebecca's heart pounded so loudly she wanted to both laugh and cry at once. Returning home, she set her new painting, the bright landscape, prominently in the living room. Even the idea of displaying it to the world no longer scared her. Before she'd realized it, she was smiling at her thoughts. There was no longer that desperate melancholy, that empty cage called the perfect marriage. There was the possibility of following her own desires, learning to build relationships not by a blueprint, but by her own heart. In the twilight of her small apartment, lit only by a desk lamp, Rebecca studied her reflection in the mirror. Staring back at her was a woman whose eyes contained sparks of hope and a gentle inner strength. Maybe the road ahead was not free of difficulty: legalities of divorce, gossip from outsiders, personal fears. But she was no longer the person who would silently endure someone else's polite indifference, oblivious to her depth. The next morning she rose early, not from anxious insomnia, but from anticipation of the day. She brewed coffee and stepped onto the tiny balcony with its rather shabby railing, inhaling the cool air. A new chapter begins, she thought, as if she were writing a novel. Though she didn't know what surprises fate had in store, she felt truly alive for the first time in ages. The past was behind her, the house with its white walls and expensive appliances concealing her unhappiness. The relationship where silence and scheduling replaced warmth and sincerity. The future, full of color and uncertainty, both frightened and beckoned her. But the greatest revelation was that now her choice determined which direction she'd go. Ethan was there, a gentle but steady support who never tried to rule her life. Michael no longer loomed behind her with demands, and Rebecca herself was finally unafraid of her own boldness. "I can do this. I'm alive. I'm smiling," echoed inside her, and a smile found its way onto her lips. Outside, the morning haze was slowly lifting, and the sun rose, bathing the city in warm tones. A new day was dawning, and Rebecca was ready to step into it without looking back.